Hey, Rob B here with Rob D, and you are listening to the Property Podcast. Now, what if I told you could invest in property 300 miles away from your home, refurb them, let them out, and be wildly successful? Well, somehow, our guest on the show this week has achieved just that.
Welcome to the Property Podcast, where every Thursday morning, property investors come to be informed and inspired. We've got an absolute treat for you today in the form of an interview with a landlord who is doing something that I previously would have said was really not a good idea. He's investing in properties, like Rob said, from 300 miles away, and not just any old properties, but student HMOs, which are currently rented out to 28 different tenants, and he does everything himself. So keep listening because you're going to find out exactly how he makes that work. And make sure you stick around to the end because in Hub Extra, we've got a resource which is not only going to keep you entertained, but make you smarter as well.
So it's time for our news story, or this week, news stories of the week. We've got two that are very much related and make an interesting contrast as well. But let's start with a news story from landlordzone.co.uk. And the headline reads, "Step away from disastrous rent controls campaign, landlords urge Sadiq Khan." Now, rent controls, they're never going to be popular with landlords, Rob. That's understandable. But they make an interesting argument. Now, Sadiq Khan has been talking about rent controls for some time. This isn't new. But obviously, the current Mayor of London wants to get re-elected as the Mayor of London, so he's bringing forward his proposals. Landlords, understandably, are not happy. Rob, what's behind this story?
Yeah, this is something that Sadiq Khan used heavily when he was campaigning for his re-election originally last year, before campaigning was suspended for COVID, which basically means they're doing it all again. There were loads of stories back then about his plans to introduce rent controls, and there are some more of those stories again this time around. But if you are a landlord in London who's worried about this, don't be too worried, because at the moment, the Mayor of London doesn't have the power to actually do this. He would need to go and ask the central government for new powers to actually make this happen. And there's no guarantee that he would. Now, as you said, Rob, the fact that landlords and landlord organisations are against this is not surprising. They're not into it from a personal interest reason, but they're talking about it from an economics angle, saying that actually all it does is not reduce rents, but constrain supply and give tenants less choice, which is true from wherever it's been implemented before. However, the really interesting bit here is that since Sadiq Khan was campaigning on this issue a year ago, rents in London, according to Zoopla, have fallen by 9.8%. Going into this other news story now, the latest monthly market briefing from Zoopla shows that outside London, rents have increased by an average of 2.6% over the last year. But in London, they've fallen by 9.8%, which is absolutely massive. That is a huge, huge drop, and does make it a slightly odd time to be talking about rent controls.
It does. It makes it very odd. It makes it a lot harder for Sadiq to get his case across and campaign against this right now. It doesn't really suit him. Although the rents falling are not a surprise, not because of COVID. That's not a surprise that it's been impacted that way. But rents over the years, if you actually look at the data, are normally quite good at regulating themselves, the market regulating itself. Because if you look at rental inflation, it matches very close to normal inflation. Property prices are more volatile, but rents aren't as volatile. Now, of course, rents in London are expensive. That cannot be denied. That is the case. But if you look at the long-term data of London, there are peaks and troughs. After it goes up for a while, it often does fall. This is not the first fall in London rents. In fact, there's been many. So, do we need regulation? Obviously, we've got an underlying bias, being the Property Podcast. But if a market can regulate itself, then why not just leave it alone? Extra regulation by government, for me at least, is something I prefer to avoid.
HMOs are a very popular strategy in the world of property. It's something we get asked about all the time. So this week we've got a real treat for you in the form of an interview with someone who is executing the HMO strategy extremely successfully. Loads to learn from him. We'll hear about who he is in just a second. But first, if you're not familiar with the strategy, thinking HMO, what on earth is that? Well, HMO stands for House in Multiple Occupancy. And that basically means a property that's rented out to at least 3 people who are not all part of the same household, but they share some facilities. So for example, if you've got a 3-bedroom house with 5 family members living in it, it's not an HMO. If you've got exactly the same 3-bedroom house, but each bedroom is rented out separately to sharers and they're sharing the kitchen and bathroom, then it is an HMO. The reason that they're so popular and you hear about HMOs so much is that they are on the high end of the cash flow spectrum. The yields can be very attractive. And they're not necessarily on the low end of the growth spectrum either, because you can finance them in a slightly different way. However, HMOs are on the high end of the effort spectrum. This is what puts a lot of people off HMOs. You're either going to be putting in a significant amount of your own time to set them up and manage them, or you're going to be paying someone else to do it, which is going to take up a lot of their time and therefore reduce your yield. There's also a lot of regulation that comes with HMOs, and they're not straightforward, so they can frighten investors off. So there are reasons that they're very attractive, but also reasons to be cautious. And that's why it's so important before rushing in to take lessons from people who are already doing it and doing it really successfully. People like our guest today.
Yes, there's someone who's clearly not been frightened off is today's guest, Tim Bryan. Tim previously was a medical support officer in the RAF, but he's been full-time property investing since 2017. His portfolio has 5 HMOs with a total of 28 rooms that he lets out. Now, all of these properties are in Bangor, North Wales, which is a beautiful part of the world, but it's over 300 miles from where Tim lives. So it's fair to say that Tim has a lot of experience and knowledge, and today he's kindly offered to share that with us. So the first thing we wanted to know is how Tim came to be a HMO landlord, managing 28 rooms, and why in Bangor?
So when I was leaving the armed forces after doing my sort of 16 years, etc., I just thought, actually, I need to get cash flow. So I focused on going down the student HMO market. And I looked at somewhere where, really the properties were cheap, but the rents were similar down to south. And that led me to Bangor, where you get a, very good sort of return, very good sort of gross yield and a return on your capital employed. So I live in Fareham in Hampshire. I invest in Bangor in North Wales. So it's, I suppose, a sort of 5-hour drive plus a couple of breaks. And it's a long way to go, I think, really. But I think what I did when I started off, I wanted to invest locally, but actually the yields, etc., the returns just weren't there. So I basically sort of started from Fareham, put a sort of pin in the map and sort of started working outwards and looking at areas that hadn't yet recovered from the sort of 2008 property crash. The newest place I got was sort of down south, Newport in South Wales, then up towards the Midlands. And as I was looking in Wales, I sort of got looking at properties in North Wales too. And I was tracking a few properties and just the right property came up in North Wales at the right time, just a couple of months after, I started looking, and it was just the perfect property. So, I decided to go for Bangor in North Wales, and that's how I ended up investing in student HMOs in Bangor.
We were also curious about how Tim got into a position to start building his portfolio.
I ended up in a position where I recently got divorced, if you like, left my job, and I ended up with my pension and about £100,000 in the bank. So that's, it's not a small sum of money, but when you're 44 and you've liquidated all your assets, it's not a massive amount either. So I had to live off that money and invest it. So I was living off it right from the word go, and using it to invest in property. So I used that money really to buy my first property. I took out a personal loan as well to buy the property in cash. And that's really what, started my journey. And the first property was very successful, managed to get all my money back out. So it's one of those, unicorn properties, if you like. And from there, I was able just to keep my journey going. And I'm at a stage now where I have sort of replaced my income. And people talk about being financially free. It's taken me sort of, almost 4 years to get there, but I am earning a decent income from my portfolio at the moment.
So as we touched on earlier, there's a lot more to HMOs than a standard vanilla buy-to-let property. So how did Tim know what to do?
Yeah, I think there's lots of information out there in this sort of, this IT age. I'm a bit older, I'm 48, but there's information everywhere now. You just got to find it. So, I started off back in sort of, 2006, 2010, just reading a couple of books. It's all in the books. It's quite easy to digest. But I think now the main things that I listen to or look at are YouTube videos. So there's lots of people putting, useful content out on YouTube. I listen a lot to podcasts. There's, I think the advantage with YouTube videos and podcasts is they're very recent and relevant. Some of the books over time, they become a bit redundant in terms of the legislation, the strategies, etc. I also think, particularly with lockdown, there's lots of webinars out there. And of course, there's the sort of traditional sort of route, which is, property networking. I'm sure soon there'll be face-to-face meetings back up and running. And I also think, there's lots of Facebook groups, other forums that you can belong to and people you can chat with. Everything you need to know to get into HMOs or a lot of property strategies is out there available for free. And it's just, you just got to go and find it really. And then, use your own common sense about, take on board what you need to and then disregard things that you think are probably not quite right.
So before Tim did anything, he educated himself. Smart move, something that we recommend everyone does, whatever strategy they're following, especially if it's something a little bit more complex like HMOs are. So once Tim had done that research, he had a firm grasp of what he was doing. What did he do next? What was his first practical step?
I literally just put a pin in a map and then just sort of went out to places that I thought were giving really good returns. I said to somebody once, I'm buying properties, 2/3 of the price what you will in Portsmouth. But they said, of course you are, but the rents are much cheaper. And I said, no, actually they're not. One of the things that I look for is I look to get properties at a relatively cheap rate compared to where I live at the moment. But actually the rents the students pay to me are pretty much identical to what they're paying in Portsmouth and Southampton. So there's other places like that in the country. So yes, you might be getting cheaper properties, but the rent the students are paying is quite similar. So I suppose you just need to, identify what do you want to get from your property business? What are your criteria? And then you need to sort of then look at areas that are going to produce that. I'm not saying you shouldn't invest locally or in the southeast, but I just found that in terms of cash flow, it was much more, a lot more opportunity, away from here. Maybe not for capital appreciation, but certainly for cash flow.
So he's got a strategy. He's got his target tenant now, which is great. And he's selected his market area. And when you're investing away from home, that can be quite a step in itself. People don't know where to invest. So he's done that. So what became Tim's criteria for selecting a property?
Yeah, I know Bangor really well now. So I only invest in Bangor. It's quite a small university. So, I don't tend to invest in properties more than a mile away. And actually, for Bangor, there's not many properties more than a mile away. I have got a couple of properties, about 0.9 of a mile away, which is quite far compared to some properties, but they are really big properties. They provide really good living standards. And actually, those are the properties that rent really well. So I think, yes, you need to look at the infrastructure. You need to look at, what students want, etc. But sometimes they will go for sort of size and living standards against being right next door to the university. So you've got to find the right balance. In Bangor, you don't need to have any sort of immediate criteria. You get to know the districts or the areas really quite quickly about where are good to invest in. And I think speaking to the letting agents there's one or two main letting agents there, they will soon tell you what you need to do, where you need to invest and what students want. So for example, lots of the properties that I see advertised have single rooms. I just won't take on a property that has single rooms. If it does, I'll make it into a double. I've actually taken on a property and reduce the number of rooms in it because I want to future-proof my business model. I want to give at least a double room, and give a good ratio of bedrooms to bathrooms and make them en suite if I can. So yes, there are things you can do to sort of, make sure you get it right. And I suppose that's doing your research again, speaking to the people who are already investing in the area and the letting agents and listening to what they say the students want and what are the most competitive things to do.
Well, that's quite different from the kinds of landlord that I had when I was at uni, but it's a smart move. We've said it before, no matter who your tenant is, they are a client. They're paying you for a service. And what Tim's doing is almost the exact opposite of what most people will do. They'll mostly be trying to find out how can I pack as many rooms as possible into this property to increase my ROI. But what Tim's doing is smart. He's gone the other way and making sure that he is the first choice. He's got the best product on the market, and that means his properties are going to rent more easily and for more money. But they probably wouldn't rent for such good money when he takes them on. So what kind of state are these properties in when Tim first buys them?
Yeah, I'm looking for potential and I'm looking really to add value. So of course they say that you make your money when you buy a property, but also you can force the value, force appreciation by doing a refurbishment work. So all of my properties have undertaken sort of significant refurbishment. So that's one way I look to add value and to bring the property up to the standard that I think is going to make me competitive and future-proof my business. So yes, I'm looking for a good deal. That's what I enjoy partly in what I do, finding a good deal and then finding ways to add value to the property and then to refinance and get the money out. So yes, my business model is really to find refurbishments and then force appreciation that way, as well as getting a good deal in the first place.
Future-proofing is not something we hear a lot of people talking about, but it really does seem like a no-brainer. So what are the kind of things Tim is doing to make sure that he appeals to his market? Does he include bills, Netflix, for example?
With my HMOs, I offer the option really to be all-inclusive for the bills, or they can pay the bills themselves if they want to. So, and there's no sort of clear, I can't say that students want one or the other particularly. I have properties that are rented out both ways. I don't really include TVs or Netflix or things like that in it. I actually always pay for the broadband. Make sure you've got a good broadband, the highest possible spec broadband you can get. Learning online, that's really important. What I try and do, I think, is try and give big communal living areas. My target market is not sort of individuals renting rooms. It's a group of friends coming together looking to rent somewhere for the next academic year. So they've all got their own space, their own double room. They've got sort of refurbished modern kitchens and bathrooms. Some are en suite, some aren't. But I think what they really like, and I'm sort of, not surprised about, but is that the big sort of communal living areas, they really like that sort of side. And with a couple of properties too, I've managed to sort of add parking out the back. In the centre of Bangor, parking is difficult. So there's little things like that you can do really. I think I've forced the appreciation really, not so much in terms of the bricks and mortar valuation or the commercial value sometimes, but I've forced the appreciation in terms of the rent that it can obtain. I took one property on that was bringing in sort of 14 grand a year, did a massive refurb on it, and now it's rented out for 26 grand a year, and I don't even pay the bills. So I did do an extension with that property. I think students are prepared to pay top-end rents for a top-end property. They'd rather pay more for a high-end property than go to somewhere grotty and pay next to nothing. They have standards, their parents have standards for them, and they really want to have a good experience at university and a good social experience. So I've got in one of my properties, for example, there was a big conservatory. So they've got 2 lounges, they've got a pool table in the conservatory. I kind of feel in some ways I'm setting the bar higher for my competitors in some areas. There are more people like me now realizing that if you want to stay in this business for the long term, you need to provide sort of high-end products really. And that's why there's a glut of HMOs on the market, because the more old, tired landlords who would just bung in mixed-match furniture into a house and just hope that it would rent each year, they're a dying breed, and their properties aren't getting let year on year sometimes. And if they are, only some of the rooms, and then at a really sort of reduced rent.
There's a big lesson there. Providing better accommodation not only pushes up the rent, as we mentioned earlier, it also pushes up the value of the property due to the amount of rent that the property can generate, because HMO valuations are done on a multiple of the rent. So it really is a smart move. And what Tim said about how people who can't be bothered to provide a better property and are falling behind are getting pushed out of the market, that's something that I've seen from talking to people in various cities around the country. Standards are being pushed up, not just by landlords like Tim, but also by institutional players coming into the market, and universities are providing their own accommodation in some circumstances. And that doesn't mean that the market is dead for HMOs, not at all. But it does mean that it's the old, tired properties, the ones where people have just been trying to rinse as much money out of them as possible for years and years and years, that have started to struggle. So Tim's got a great approach, but like we said earlier, the logistics around HMOs can be tricky and there's lots of regulation to contend with. So how does he deal with that?
I do operate in an area that is extremely, regulated. So, and I see that as a good thing on the whole. So in Wales, unlike in England, I think all private landlords they do have to be registered with Rent Smart Wales, the national body. So I'm an accredited agent and landlord with Rent Smart Wales. You have to do a certain amount of training, etc. So it makes the organisation more regulated, and you can get sort of taken off that register, and then you can't be a landlord if you don't do things properly. At the local level, at Gwynedd, the county, they are the people who produce the HMO licences. So they have mandatory licensing and additional licensing. So it's not just, HMOs with 5 or more people living there that need a licence. Anything with 3 or more people living there, they all need a licence now. So I'm licensed locally with Gwynedd Council, and then obviously there is some duplication, which is unfortunate, but also I'm licensed nationally with Rent Smart Wales. So it is a pretty regulated arena. But I think that's the way forward. I think England will follow suit at some point in the future. And it makes makes being a landlord much more professional, makes you much more accountable too, really. And it's probably good for the tenants and the industry in the future, and that it will sort of, there'll be less landlords, but those who will have more properties and do it as a full-time business, perhaps.
We see this as a good thing too. Regulations mean better properties and better landlords. Tim is obviously leading the way here in his market, and this will absolutely reward him for it. What about finance? Tim has forced appreciation through refurbing and then greater yields off the back of it. How does it all play out when he's looking at mortgages? And does he look down a commercial route or residential lending options?
I think it's a mix, really, because I think, if you're 6 rooms or less, 3 to 6 rooms, you're still sort of under the C4 HMO sort of planning class. So I do think that there is, when you get to sort of a lot of the mainstream high street lenders don't really want to lend on HMOs which are more than 4 rooms. So you're getting towards some of the sort of non-mainstream banks. When you go to 5, 6 rooms as I have or higher, then you're going to get the sort of other types of lenders who are probably going to take a mixed view on it. It is, of course, bricks and mortar. I suppose I've got 4 of my properties are let in 5-year, 75% loan to value, buy to let mortgages. And there was sort of, your traditional sort of 5, 6 or above HMO lenders like, Precise, Paragon, Kent Reliance, Lambay. They are sort of between, 3.7% and 3.9% 5-year fixes. And I like that. And they were easy to get hold of. And yes, that they, where you are for 5 years. So I've got these mortgages as the end products, but I have bought properties in cash. I bought properties with mortgages. I bought properties with bridging, actually most of all. So yes, finance I find is really accessible, and it's as cheap as you're going to get it, really.
So there seem to be lots of upsides to the HMO strategy, but what about the downsides? After all, HMOs are notoriously difficult, especially if you're doing it remotely.
It's not a difficult strategy, investing in HMOs. I said to my kids, actually, investing in HMOs, I just need probably, a 13-year-old's basic understanding of maths. But more importantly than that, you just need, a lot of interpersonal and individual skills. It's about people skills, I suppose, building relationships and then applying a level of common sense. I think investing away from home can be more difficult. I've got a network of, local people that I can, call upon to do jobs for me. So that makes it, pretty straightforward. And when I started off in HMOs, the main reason for doing this in the first place is I wanted to be my own boss and I wanted to spend more time with my family. So I do work less hours than I used to when I had a full-time job, but not lots and lots of less hours. What I do have is a lot more flexibility in when I work. It's the old sort of cliche, really. Now I sort of, fit work around my life and not life around work, really. So I actually found that investing in a ironic sort of way, turning a negative into a positive, I found that actually investing so far away in some ways has led me to be more hands-off, because if I was local, I would have popped round to see about a leak in tap or why is the electric gone off or something, so I'm forced to employ people.
And as much as we love hearing the successes that we do, we want to know about some of the things that went wrong too, the real reality of life as a HMO landlord.
Yeah, it's not all straightforward and easy. So one of my properties, I probably, if I sold it now, it probably would just about wash its face. And I suppose that means in terms of money, I would probably get back the money that I invested and no more. So I put a lot of work in, a lot of time, a lot of stress to make no money. Now it does cash flow really, really well. And actually looking at the criteria, it would meet a lot of investors what they want from property. But when I refinanced it, I had to leave a lot of money in the property, so it slowed my journey down. So with that property, I used some builders that I used previously, and we decided to move forward on a much more bigger project together. We both went outside our comfort zone. To cut a long story short, it didn't work out. There was a 20 grand overspend, partly through to sort of problems that could have been avoided or foreseen. Property took a lot longer. There was an extra sort of 12 grand in finance fees. So it cost me an extra 30 to 35,000 pounds. And as a consequence, I've had to leave all the money in the deal. I mean, again, it still cash flows really well and it's a brilliant property for the long term. But, to move forward, you need to release as much cash as possible. So that wasn't that good. I've also had an instance where, I paid a structural engineer for, some calculations on a job for a big extension I was doing. And unfortunately, he didn't do them quite right. I went back to see him, and unfortunately, the guy was an old guy. He'd just been diagnosed with cancer, and he died a week later. So I'd forked out about £1,300 for that, and of course, I wasn't going to mention it to his widow or to chase them at all. So I just had to write that off. Those are things that you can't really plan for. And also, I've had a couple of valuations in the past that have just, for some reason, I've had a £0 valuation. So at the beginning, I thought I was going to refinance a property and buy a property, both really straightforward, nothing untoward about them. I actually went through a mortgage broker, and I had to pay first. They were really good products. I had to pay about £1,000 for both evaluations, which was high at the time, but they were going to be great products, fixed for 5 years with a bit of refurb work to do. The company used a local valuer who's, I found out now, is renowned for giving really cautious valuations. They both came back as unmortgageable for £0. I had to write off that money. I went to a different company, a different valuer, and within a few months, I came back with the valuations that I wanted or needed. But that money was written off. So those are sort of things where I've lost a bit of money or things haven't gone quite as well. But as I said, my success is far outweigh those sort of things. But it doesn't always go to plan. It is difficult and it can be stressful. And that's where you need to have a good outlook and a good mindset to keep moving forward.
So like anything in property, things can go wrong. We've recorded whole episodes about this in the past, making you aware that things in property do go wrong. And when you're dealing with a more complex investment like HMOs, there are more things that can go wrong and the consequences can be more severe. But that never means quit. It just means you need to persevere. So Tim mentioned outlook and mindset. So important to consider in property. How has that helped him?
I think you can do all the research you want. You can get a lot of knowledge and a lot of information about property, but you need to have the right sort of mindset, really. I do see a lot of people who've expressed an interest in property, but they never really seem to get going. And I think when I look back to my career in the military, one thing that I take away from it is that I come away with a very much of a can-do attitude. In the military, you get placed in a lot of different jobs and a lot of different locations, and you just become really robust and resilient in different circumstances. You become really good at problem solving and having a sort of optimistic glass half full attitude. And I think that's really important to have the right mindset if you're going to invest in property, because it can be quite worrying and you can't be focusing on moving forward at the same time as worrying about what could go wrong.
Thank you, Tim, for this podcast. We're really lucky in the property podcast. We could have done an episode on HMOs and given you a little bit of knowledge that we have. But by listening to Tim, we get a real expert giving us real advice who's in the trenches doing this. And as we've heard, HMOs can be super rewarding, but they can also be really difficult. And it's that risk-reward ratio. Sometimes you have to do the hard stuff to get the good stuff. But Tim's been prepared to do that. He's doing it the right way. He's providing great accommodation and listening to what his tenants want. And that's giving him great results. But that's not the only thing he's been getting right, Rob.
No, he's really been keeping up with the regulations and standards, which is putting him ahead of the tired and lazy landlords that you do get. And you do especially get them in student accommodation. And like I said earlier, they're going to be feeling this now. There'll be landlords who've not invested in their properties for possibly decades, and they've just been getting by and not felt the need to invest. But now they're finding every year it takes their property another week or two to rent. They may be having to cut the rent by £5 or £10 a month just to get it rented, and they're going to find themselves on the wrong end of this trend that Tim has positioned himself absolutely on the right side of. And what's the consequence of that? Well, it's giving him better yields and better financing options as well. It's not just the right thing to do and the smart thing to do, but it's a financially rewarding thing to do as well. HMO landlords are also facing competition from student pod style developments. This is accommodation that's often very professional, very sleek, is of a high spec and very convenient, but for the most part doesn't have that communal element. So what Tim has done in quite a smart way is position himself completely on the other side of that and really emphasize the communal features of his own properties to make them really appeal to groups of friends who are looking for that, which is a great idea. There are going to be people who want their own space and are quite happy with a student pod style accommodation, but there are also always going to be people who want more of the university group of friends experience. So rather than trying to compete against where the rest of the market is, he's come up with his own product that appeals to a niche segment of the market that is not so well served. And so it's a market that's wide open. And the other thing that I thought was really interesting from this interview is what Tim had to say about mindset, something we've talked about a lot on this podcast over the years. And clearly with his military background, he's learned a thing or two that he can apply to executing more advanced strategies like this, especially from a remote location. And actually, there's lots of ex-forces people who seem to do very well in property. There must be something to it. And Rob, that's one of the biggest takeaways for me from this interview. It's that so much in property depends on the person. We had another interview like this a few weeks back, and this is another example of the same thing again, where if someone came to me saying that they were thinking about investing in HMOs from 300 miles away, I'd say, don't do that. It doesn't sound like a smart idea at all. But he's done it and it's absolutely worked. But that's not because it's easy or because it's what everyone should be doing, but it's because of what Tim is like as a person and the skills he's got and the attitude that he's got.
You're right. It's not the first thing I'd recommend to people. You know, do HMOs 300 miles away. It's not number one on the list. But for Tim, it's worked. And for Tim, it's the right thing to do. But it's not the type of strategy that you can dip your toe into. You have to be all in. This is an all-in strategy. And if you go all in, you can get all in results. You will be rewarded, but you can't half-heartedly do HMOs plus refurbing them 300 miles away from your house. So you may listen to this and go, I like those rewards. And yeah, who wouldn't? Great rewards. But if you're not prepared to do all the other bits that Tim's been prepared to do, then it's not going to be for you. You have to be committed. But if you are committed, you can get the results. And Tim has absolutely got those. So thank you, Tim. Thank you for sharing your story. It's been great to listen along and see the success that you've deservedly had.
Time now for Hub Extra, that part of the show where we give you that little bit more before we send you on your way. And it's backed up by the Hub Extra email that Property Hub members receive in their inbox every Friday morning. This week, we've got a resource highlighted by our producer, Dan, which neither of us had heard of, but looks really great. It's a YouTube channel called TED Ed. So you've probably heard of TED, which is where speakers give talks on different topics, and you get some great ones of those, some of which we've talked about on the podcast in the past. But I had no idea that the same organisation has a separate YouTube channel called TED Ed, with the Ed standing for education. And these are just short animated videos, about 5 minutes long, covering all kinds of different topics. And I think it's primarily meant to be for kids from the way it's presented, but I've just gone through and bookmarked a load of these, Rob.
Yeah, it looks fantastic. I was saying to you before we started recording, Rob, that I'm always trying too hard with internet resources these days. Like I'm looking for that niche blog or that place or that resource that no one else has found on the internet yet. But TED is massive. And because I haven't really engaged with TED videos for quite a while now, I hadn't come across TED Ed, and what a miss. This looks absolutely fantastic. I can see myself sharing some videos of my kids, but also deep diving into a few of these myself. They look really, really good. So producer Dan not only making us sound wonderful, but giving us top resources as well.
So you can find that by searching TED Ed on YouTube, or you can find it in the show notes for this episode. But make sure you don't go too deep down that particular rabbit hole, because you need to keep some time free for the Property Podcast, because we're not going away for long. That's the end of this episode, but we're going to be back with Ask Rob and Rob next Tuesday, and then another fine episode of the Property Podcast next Thursday. For now, though, thank you to Tim for this week's interview, and thank you to you for listening, and have a wonderful rest of your week. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.